She had no tears left to cry. Her body was broken, her clothes torn to ribbons. Her skin was a road map of bruises and cuts, each one a memory of a hand, a rope, a fall. But the deepest wound, the one that truly bled, wasn't on her flesh. It was in her heart. Mara Quinn was only 24 years old, but in a single, terrible night, she had lost every last piece of faith she ever had in her own family. Her brother-in-law, Caleb, a man she'd shared meals with, a man who called her sister, had promised her work. A good job in a nearby town, he'd said. Money to help her and her sister Eliza get through the coming winter. It was a lie, a filthy, rotten trap. Caleb hadn't led her to honest work. He'd led her to a clearing in the woods and sold her like a piece of livestock, sold her to a monster of a man named Silas Crow, a trafficker whose name was whispered in fear across the territory. And the worst part, the part that twisted the knife? Eliza had believed every word her husband said. She didn't question him. She didn't defend her own sister. When Mara screamed, when she begged, Eliza just turned her back. She left her sister to the wolves. Dragged away in the dead of night, Mara had been beaten, bound, and thrown into the back of a wagon. Every bone in her body screamed. She wasn't alone either. There was another girl in the wagon, younger than her, with eyes full of a terror so deep it looked like she'd already died. Her name was Lily. Mara had made a silent promise to the girl. "We get out of this, together." But Silas's men were careless. They stopped for water, leaving one drunkard to watch the wagon. It was a slim chance, a sliver of light in the darkness. Mara worked the ropes on her wrists, her skin tearing until they were loose enough. She whispered to Lily, "When I go, you run. Don't look back." She burst from the wagon, a desperate, wild thing. She slammed her shoulder into the guard, sending him stumbling. And then she ran. She heard a gunshot crack behind her. But she didn't stop. She just prayed Lily had made it out, too. Her knees were scraped raw when she fell. Her shoulder screamed from the impact. Blood oozed from a deep gash on her hip. But she kept running, because the fire of betrayal burned hotter than any physical pain. Hours later, stumbling through the wide-open plains, she saw him. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on her torn shirt. The dry grass cut her bare feet with every agonizing step. Her vision blurred, swimming in and out of focus. A figure on horseback, riding toward a set of ranch gates. Her broken mind, her exhausted body could only scream one thought. "He's here to claim me. Another buyer, another one of Silas's devils." Mara collapsed to the ground, the last of her strength gone. She lifted her face, dirt and sweat caking her cheeks, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, just make it quick." She closed her eyes, expecting the cold steel of a pistol barrel. She expected the final deafening crack. But instead, there was only silence. The horse stopped. Boots hit the dry earth. The man dismounted, and then he froze. Gideon Hale had seen death more times than he could count. He'd worn a badge once, been a lawman feared and respected from one end of the frontier to the other. But that life was over. It ended the night his wife and child were murdered, a brutal act of revenge for a case he couldn't close. He had buried his badge with them, swore an oath over their graves never to take up arms in the name of justice again. Now he lived alone on this ranch, a fortress of solitude built to keep the blood and the law and the memories out. Yet here, lying in the dust at his gates, was a young woman begging for death. Her wrists were raw and bloody from ropes, her body a canvas of cruelty, her soul shattered into a million pieces. For the first time in 10 years, Gideon felt his hands tremble. Not from fear, from a white-hot volcanic fury. He didn't draw his gun. He threw it to the ground. He dropped to his knees beside her, his old joints cracking in protest. With one swift, angry motion, He drew his knife and sliced through the rope that still clung to her wrist. He pulled the red scarf from his own neck, the one his wife had made him, and pressed it hard against her bleeding hip. He lifted her into his arms. She was light as a bird, her head falling limp against his chest. She had begged him to kill her. But Gideon Hale knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that this was no random crime. This was betrayal. This was cruelty. This was the darkest kind of slavery. And he could not look away. He stood there at his own threshold, the silence of his exile shattered, holding this broken girl in his arms. He had sworn never to fight again. But could he really turn his back now? What kind of secret could drive a young woman to beg for death? And how was this one moment, this one choice, about to drag him back into the hell he had tried so hard to escape? The smell of dust and horse sweat filled the air as Gideon carried Mara across the yard. Her head rested against his chest, her breath shallow and ragged. She felt as light as a feather, but she carried the weight of the world's sorrow. He laid her gently on a wooden bench near the water trough, the one he'd built with his own hands years ago. He fetched a tin cup, the metal cool against his skin, and filled it from the pump. Her lips trembled when the water touched them. She drank like a woman who had crossed the entire desert on foot, each swallow a desperate fight for life. A little color returned to her face, but the hollow look in her eyes told him the deepest wounds were the ones he couldn't see. For a long time, Gideon said nothing. He had grown comfortable with silence. Words were dangerous. Words held promises, and promises got people killed. But when she finally spoke, her voice was like broken glass. "My own kin sold me," the words tumbled out, heavy and sharp. "My sister's husband. He promised me honest work, and she believed him. She believed every single lie." Mara's gaze drifted to the horizon, seeing nothing. "They handed me over to a man who buys and sells women like they're mules." Gideon's jaw tightened. The red scarf he'd used to stop her bleeding was now soaked through. He had seen the worst of humanity in his time as a lawman, but betrayal by your own blood? That was a cut that went deeper than any outlaw's knife. Mara tried to sit up, but a wave of pain shot through her and she fell back against the bench with a gasp. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, futile gesture, as if trying to hide from the world. "It's not just the beating," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's knowing I was nothing more than a coin in their pocket, that my own sister—" She just turned her face away. Gideon knelt, his weathered face level with hers, his eyes clear and steady. "You are not nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You fought. You ran. You made it here when they wanted you gone. That's not nothing." For the first time, a flicker of something lit up in her eyes. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. She had been treated like property, like an object to be bought and sold. But here, in the dirt and grime of this lonely ranch, a stranger was treating her like a person again. He stood and walked to a small cupboard in the corner of the barn. He pulled out a clean cotton shirt, worn soft from years of use. It had belonged to his wife. He set it down beside her without a word, then turned to give her privacy. She looked at the shirt, then at his back, and her lips quivered. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the distant howl of a coyote. The land was vast and empty, a sea of prairie. But the danger wasn't gone. It was just gathering in the shadows. Mara knew a man like Silas Crow wouldn't just let his property go. He would come for her. And Gideon knew it too. The man who had sworn off violence, the man who had buried his past, might soon be forced to dig it all up again, because Silas Crow was coming. The only question was how soon. Night fell heavy over the ranch. The crickets began their song, a steady rhythm against the silence. In the dim, flickering light of a single lantern, Gideon sat at his old wooden table. Across from him, Mara picked at a piece of bread he'd set out for her. Each bite seemed to catch in her throat. For a decade, Gideon had eaten his meals alone. He spoke only to his horse and the wind. Now, across the table, sat a girl carrying more pain than any one person should ever have to bear. The silence in the room was no longer comforting. It was heavy, pressing, full of unspoken questions. Finally, Gideon broke it. His voice was rough from disuse. "The man who bought you. I know his name." Mara's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes snapped up to meet his. "Silas Crow," Gideon continued, his voice flat and hard as stone. "He's been in the business of buying and selling human flesh since before you were born. And once I tried to stop him." He leaned back in his chair, the lantern light casting deep shadows across his face. "I was a lawman back then, wore a badge. I believed in things like justice. I thought good men could stop evil men like him." He paused, his gaze turning inward. "I was wrong. I failed, and my family paid the price for that failure. I lost everything because of him." He stared at his hands, calloused and scarred. "I buried my badge with them, and I promised myself I would never fight another man's battle again." Mara watched him, her eyes sharp and intelligent despite the exhaustion. "So you'll turn me away, too?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, her voice cracking with a fresh wave of despair. Gideon didn't answer right away. His eyes went to a small, locked drawer in his desk. He hadn't opened it in 10 years. Inside lay his old, tarnished badge. He could almost feel the cold weight of it in his hand. He closed his fist, his knuckles white. "No," he said, the word like a stone dropping into a deep well. "I won't turn you away." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "But if we're going to stand against Silas, we can't do it with guns alone. He has men, he has money, he has half the lawmen in the territory in his pocket." "We need proof," he continued, the old lawman inside him stirring from its long slumber. "Irrefutable proof. And we need to be smarter than him." He laid out the plan, slowly, patiently. The doctor in the next town, a man Gideon trusted, would document her wounds. The torn clothes, the ropes, everything would be saved as evidence. Gideon would send a coded wire to an old friend, a U.S. Marshal who couldn't be bought. But it was the bait that made Mara's eyes widen. "We won't go hunting for Silas," Gideon said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "We'll make him come to us, right here." "How?" she whispered. "I'll offer him something he can't possibly resist, a trade. For a pair of horses so rare, so valuable, he'll think I'm a fool. He won't be able to stop himself from coming to gloat, and to take back what he thinks is his." Mara leaned back, her breath unsteady. For the first time she saw him, not just a reclusive rancher hiding from the world. She saw Gideon Hale, the man the outlaws used to fear, a man who had tried to bury his past, but couldn't bury the fire of justice that still smoldered in his chest. But as he finished speaking, his eyes fell to her hands, which were twisting a small object in her lap. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight. Mara looked down. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "Caleb gave it to me. My brother-in-law. He said he found it, that it was a good luck charm." Gideon reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "Let me see it." She handed it over. He turned the little bird over and over in his palm. On the bottom, so faint it was almost invisible, were 2 tiny initials carved into the wood. G.H. He had carved this bird himself, more than 10 years ago. He had placed it in the tiny hand of his sleeping daughter the night before he rode out to arrest Silas Crow's partner. It was the last time he ever saw her alive. The world tilted on its axis. Caleb, her brother-in-law. He hadn't just found this. He couldn't have. There was only one way he could have gotten it. He had to have been there. That night. The night Gideon's world ended. The revelation hit Gideon like a physical blow. This wasn't just a random girl stumbling onto his land. This wasn't a coincidence. The past wasn't just haunting him anymore. It had walked right through his front gate. Caleb wasn't some petty, greedy man who'd made a bad choice. He was a ghost from Gideon's worst nightmare. He remembered a face, a young stable hand, barely a boy, who worked for the very man Gideon had put behind bars. The man whose cronies had come for his family in revenge. A boy who had vanished the day after the murders. It was him. It had to be. "This isn't just about Silas anymore, is it?" Mara whispered, seeing the storm gathering in his eyes. "No," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. "It never was." The plan had to change. It was bigger now. The trap wasn't just for Silas Crow. It was for all of them, for Caleb, and for the ghosts of the past. But as he looked at the wooden bird, another colder thought slithered into his mind. If Caleb was there that night, what did he see? What did he do? And why, after all these years, had he resurfaced, tied to the very same monster Gideon had failed to stop? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last. Gideon realized he wasn't just setting a trap for his enemies. He was walking into one himself. Mara saw the shift in him, the raw pain that flashed in his eyes before being replaced by iron resolve. She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but also a strange sense of purpose. This was her fight, too. She wouldn't be the victim anymore. "While I was with them," she said, forcing the words out, "I heard things. They weren't just moving girls in that wagon. There was a hidden compartment." Gideon's head snapped up. "What was in it?" "A book," she said. "A leather-bound ledger. Silas was obsessed with it. He said it was his insurance policy, that it had names in it, important names. Judges, sheriffs, politicians. The tendrils of Silas Crow's corruption ran deep. That ledger wasn't just insurance. It was the key to tearing his entire empire down. And now, they had a new piece of bait. Not just the horses. Not just Mara. But the lie that Mara knew where that ledger was hidden. The wire Gideon sent to his martial contact was different now. It was more urgent, more dangerous. He wasn't just asking for help with a trafficker. He was declaring war on a shadow government. But he had to do something else first. Something risky. He needed to get a message to Eliza, Mara's sister. He needed to know what she knew. He couldn't trust the local law, so he rode to the next town over to a general store run by an old woman named Martha, a woman whose husband he'd saved from a false charge years ago. He gave her a sealed note. "Get this to Eliza Quinn," he said, and only to her. The note contained no threats, no accusations, just 3 simple questions. Does your husband have nightmares? Does he ever talk about a fire? Does he carry a small wooden bird? He didn't know if the message would reach her, or if she would even understand it. But he had to try. He had to know if she was a victim, too, or if the betrayal ran even deeper than Mara imagined. Back at the ranch, the two of them prepared for war. The rare Arabian horses were a perfect lure, but Gideon didn't rely on them alone. He was a man who knew the land, who had survived in it by his wits. He spent a day setting subtle traps. A tripwire connected to a string of old tin cans in the gully, a section of the corral fence, weakened just enough to give way with a hard shove. He even rigged a deadfall trap near the old well, a heavy log suspended by a single rope. Mara was not idle. The fear was still there, a cold snake in her belly, but it was being pushed aside by a hot, simmering anger. She wasn't the broken girl who had collapsed at the gate anymore. She helped Gideon, her hands steady. She knew things about Silas's men. One was superstitious, afraid of owls. Another was always drunk. Small details that could mean the difference between life and death. She found an old hunting rifle in the barn, rusted but serviceable. Gideon watched her clean it with an expert's care. You know how to use that? He asked. My father taught me, she said, her voice quiet. Taught me to shoot straight and never waste a bullet. That night, as they shared another silent meal, the air was thick with tension, the quiet before the storm. Gideon found himself looking at her, and for a fleeting, painful moment, he saw his daughter, not as she was, but as she might have been, strong, resilient, a survivor. Mara looked at him and saw the protector she never had, the father figure who didn't turn away. A fragile, unspoken bond had formed between them, and it made the stakes infinitely higher. The next evening, the ranch was too quiet. The horses shuffled in their stalls, their ears twitching, sensing the tension in the air. Mara stood in the shadows of the barn door, the heavy rifle in her hands. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Gideon had prepared everything. The 2 Arabian horses, bait of the highest quality, were tied to a post near the corral, their sleek coats gleaming under the rising moon. A single lantern swung from the main gate, its yellow glow a soft, steady beacon. The perfect invitation. Out beyond the fence, hidden in the brush and the long shadows, U.S. Marshal Thompson and his 3 deputies lay in wait, rifles ready. Mara's stomach twisted into a knot when she saw them, shadows detaching themselves from the darkness at the far edge of the pasture. Men on horseback, riding not with the casual gait of visitors, but with the hard, urgent purpose of predators. At their front rode Silas Crow, his face a mask of cruel arrogance even in the half-light. Beside him, looking smaller, twitchier, was Caleb, her brother-in-law, the man who had condemned her with a smile, and behind them, trailing like a ghost, was her sister, Eliza, clutching a dark shawl around her shoulders, her face pale and terrified in the moonlight. The riders pulled up just outside the ranch gate. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry, unforgiving earth. He didn't even look at the horses. His eyes were fixed on the simple ranch house. "Hail!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I know you're in there, and I know you have my property. Send her out, and I might just let you live." Caleb scrambled off his horse, holding up a piece of paper. "We have a contract," he shouted, his voice high and strained. "She belongs to us. It's legal." Mara's blood boiled. She wanted to scream, to fire the rifle, to let them know she was no man's property. But Gideon laid a steadying hand on her arm. "Wait for the signal." Gideon stepped out of the house, his hands empty, his hat pulled low to shadow his face. He walked forward slowly, each step measured, deliberate. He stopped 20 feet from the gate. "You come to my land?" he said, his voice calm and dangerously low. "You bring your lies and your chains, but you've made a mistake, Silas. Tonight, you walk into a trap of your own making." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A trap? You old relic, you couldn't even protect your own wife and child. What makes you think you can stop me?" He reached for the pistol at his hip. "And this time," he snarled, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "I'll do the job myself." That was it. The confession. Gideon's world narrowed to the space between him and the monster at his gate. The marshal's plan, the careful evidence, all of it evaporated in a rush of pure, cold rage. But before he could move, before the marshals could spring their trap, something else happened. From the side, from the darkness near the road, another rider appeared. A lone figure on a pale horse, moving with an eerie silence. The figure stopped and pulled back the hood of a dusty cloak. It was Eliza, but not the terrified, cowed woman who had arrived with Silas. Her face was set like stone, and in her hand she held a loaded shotgun, aimed directly at her husband. The world held its breath. Every man, lawman, and outlaw alike was frozen in shock. Silas stared, his hand hovering over his gun. Caleb's jaw dropped, his face turning a pasty white. Even Gideon was stunned into silence. "Eliza, what in God's name are you doing?" Caleb stammered, taking a half step back. "I got your note," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from her before. She wasn't looking at Caleb. Her eyes were locked on Gideon. "I got it. And I remember." She turned her gaze to her husband, and her eyes were filled with a terrible, cold fire. "I remember the nightmares, Caleb, the way you scream in your sleep. I remember finding that little wooden bird in your trunk, and you telling me it was just a trinket you found." Her voice broke, just for a second. "And I remember the smell of smoke on your clothes that night, all those years ago. The night you told me you were out playing cards." She cocked both hammers of the shotgun. The sound was like a thunderclap in the dead quiet. "You were there," she whispered, the accusation hanging in the air. "You stood by and watched them die. And then you brought this evil to my own sister." Silas recovered first. He let out a sneering laugh. "The little mouse grew some teeth. It doesn't matter. Kill him, and you'll hang for it." "Maybe," Eliza said, her knuckles white on the stock of the gun, "but he won't hurt anyone ever again." That was the moment chaos erupted. Silas finally drew his pistol, but he didn't aim at Gideon. He aimed at Eliza. Gideon shouted, "Now!" and dove for cover. The marshals opened fire from the brush, and Mara, from the barn, pulled the rope Gideon had showed her. The weakened corral fence gave way with a crack of splintering wood. A dozen panicked horses, Gideon's entire herd, burst free, thundering directly toward Silas's men. It was a stampede. Hooves pounded the earth, dirt flew, and the night was filled with the terrified whinnying of horses and the screams of men. Gunfire cracked from all directions. One of Silas's men went down, trampled. Another fired wildly, his bullet sparking off the iron gate hinge inches from Gideon's head. Mara ducked low, her heart hammering against her ribs. She raised the rifle, found a target in her sights, and squeezed the trigger. One of the gunmen aiming at the marshals cried out and clutched his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. In the swirling dust and smoke, Caleb made a run for it. He tried to grab Eliza's horse's reins to pull her down, but she was ready for him. She swung the heavy shotgun like a club, catching him square in the side of the head. He crumpled to the ground in a heap. Silas, meanwhile, ignored the chaos. He was a man possessed, his eyes locked on Gideon. He fired twice, the bullets ripping through the wooden wall Gideon was using for cover. This was no longer about a girl or a ledger. This was about finishing a 10-year-old blood feud. Gideon fired back, his old pistol bucking in his hand. The skills he thought he'd buried came roaring back to life. He moved from cover to cover, a ghost in the moonlit chaos. His shots precise, controlled. He wasn't the wild, vengeful man he'd been a moment ago. He was the lawman again, cold, focused, deadly. Marshal Thompson and his men were closing in, rounding up the disorganized remnants of Silas's gang. The tide had turned, but Silas wasn't running. He was advancing, using the panicked horses as a moving shield, getting closer and closer to the main house. Gideon realized with a sickening jolt what he was after. Not him, not Mara. The ledger. Silas thought Mara had hidden it in the house. The fight wasn't over. It was just moving to a new, more dangerous location, and Mara was right in the middle of it. Silas Crow kicked open the door to the small ranch house, his pistol leading the way. The room was empty, lit by a single lantern on the table, its flame dancing nervously. He scanned the room, his eyes wild. The ledger had to be here. Without it, he was a dead man. The names in that book were the only thing keeping him from a hangman's noose. He didn't see Mara hiding in the deep shadows of the corner, behind a stack of old crates. She held her breath, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands. Her mind was racing. The marshals were outside. Gideon was outside. In here, she was alone with the monster. Silas started tearing the place apart. He flipped the table, sending the lantern crashing to the floor. The glass shattered, and flames began to lick at the spilled oil, crawling up the wooden floorboards. The house was on fire. Outside, Gideon saw the orange glow blossom in the windows, and his blood ran cold. "Mara!" He broke cover and ran for the house, Marshal Thompson shouting his name behind him. Silas's remaining men were either down or had surrendered, but the true danger was just beginning. Inside, the smoke was already getting thick. Mara choked, her eyes streaming. The fire was spreading fast, cutting off her path to the door. Silas, seemingly oblivious to the flames, was now frantically pulling books from a small shelf, throwing them to the floor. "Where is it, girl?" he roared, finally spotting her. "Where did you hide my book?" Mara raised the rifle, but her hands were shaking. In the flickering firelight, Silas looked less like a man and more like a demon, his face contorted in a mask of furious greed. "I don't have it!" she coughed, backing away as the flames crept closer. "Liar!" he shrieked and lunged at her. She pulled the trigger. The rifle boomed in the small room, the recoil slamming into her sore shoulder. Silas grunted and stumbled back, clutching his leg where the bullet had torn through the fleshy part of his thigh. It wasn't a kill shot, but it bought her a precious second. Just then, the front door burst open, and Gideon plunged through the smoke and heat. He saw Mara, cornered by the fire. He saw Silas, wounded but still on his feet, raising his pistol for another shot. Gideon didn't hesitate. He charged forward, slamming into Silas with the force of a freight train. The two men crashed to the floor, rolling through the spreading flames. Gideon's sleeve caught fire, and he grunted in pain, beating it out against the floorboards. Silas was like a cornered animal. He fought with a desperate, brutal strength, his fingers gouging at Gideon's eyes. Gideon blocked the attack, his fist connecting with Silas's jaw with a sickening crack. The fire was roaring now, the heat unbearable. The roof was starting to groan. "Mara, get out!" Gideon yelled, struggling to pin Silas down. "Through the window!" Mara scrambled toward the back window, smashing the glass with the butt of her rifle. She was halfway out when she looked back. Silas had managed to pull a knife from his boot. He plunged it deep into Gideon's side. Gideon cried out, his body arching in pain. His grip loosened. Silas pushed him off and staggered to his feet, a triumphant, bloody grin on his face. He stood over Gideon, raising the knife for the final killing blow. "This is for my partner," he hissed, "and for your pretty little wife." Mara screamed. She wasn't through the window yet. She couldn't get a clear shot. It was over, but it wasn't. A section of the burning roof chose that exact moment to give way. A heavy, flaming beam crashed down from above. It didn't hit Gideon. It didn't hit Mara. It fell directly on top of Silas Crow. He let out one last, horrified scream as he was crushed, vanishing in an explosion of sparks and fire. Gideon, clutching his bleeding side, dragged himself backward, away from the intense heat. Mara rushed back inside, ignoring the danger, and grabbed his arm. Together, they stumbled out of the burning house and collapsed onto the dirt yard, just as the entire roof caved in with a deafening roar. They lay there, gasping for air, watching the flames claw at the night sky. The marshals rushed to their side, pulling them further from the heat, shouting for water. The gunfight was over. The house was gone. Silas Crow was dead. But as Mara looked at Gideon, pale and bleeding in the firelight, she knew the price of this victory had been devastatingly high. The dust settled. The roar of the fire subsided into a hungry crackle. Marshal Thompson knelt beside Gideon, pressing a field dressing against the bloody wound in his side. "You're a stubborn fool, Hale," Thompson said, his voice gruff but laced with relief. "But you're alive." Gideon just grunted, his face tight with pain. His eyes found Mara's. She was covered in soot, her hair singed, but she was safe. That was all that mattered. The other marshals were tending to the wounded and securing the prisoners. Caleb was conscious, groaning on the ground with his hands bound behind him, a massive lump swelling on the side of his head. Eliza stood nearby, the shotgun now resting on the ground. She was watching Mara, her face a mixture of shame, fear, and a sliver of hope. The fire had consumed the ranch house completely, turning Gideon's 10 years of solitude into a pile of glowing embers. It was an ending, a brutal, cleansing fire. As the marshals loaded Caleb onto a wagon, he looked at Eliza, his eyes full of pathetic pleading. "Eliza, tell them I was forced into it. Silas made me." Eliza looked from her husband to her sister. She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening. "He's lying," she said, her voice steady and clear for all to hear. "He went to Silas on his own. He sold my sister for a handful of silver, and he was there, all those years ago, when Mr. Hale's family was killed. He did nothing. He just watched." It was the final nail in Caleb's coffin. He slumped in defeat, the last of his lies stripped away. The head marshal helped Gideon to his feet. "We found the ledger, Gideon," he said quietly. "It was in a false bottom of Silas's saddlebag. Looks like Mara's story scared him into bringing it with him." He clapped a hand on Gideon's good shoulder. "The name's in this thing. It's going to tear this territory apart. We're going to be able to clean house all thanks to you." And to her. He nodded toward Mara. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tarnished silver star. Gideon's old badge. "There's still a place for you in the service, Gideon. We need men like you." Gideon looked at the badge, the symbol of the life that had cost him everything. Then he looked at the smoking ruins of his home. And then he looked at Mara. He gently pushed the marshal's hand away. "My place is here," he said. He wasn't a lawman anymore. He was something else, a guardian. As the sun began to rise, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and pink, Eliza walked slowly over to Mara. The two sisters stood in silence for a long moment. "I can't forgive you," Mara said, her voice raw with emotion. "Not now. Maybe not ever. But I won't hate you. You did the right thing in the end." Tears streamed down Eliza's face. "I was a coward," she whispered. "I was so afraid of him. I'm so sorry, Mara." She didn't ask for forgiveness, just stated the truth. Mara gave a small, weary nod. It was a start. A fragile, broken beginning. Weeks turned into months. The news came that Caleb and the rest of Silas's gang were sentenced to hang. The ledger had done its work, leading to the arrest of a dozen corrupt officials, including 2 judges and a sheriff. A wave of justice, born from a night of fire and blood, was washing over the territory. With the help of Marshal Thompson and some folks from town who remembered the lawman Gideon Hale used to be, a new house began to rise from the ashes of the old one. It was smaller, simpler, but it was a home. Gideon's wound healed, leaving a jagged scar on his side, another map of his past. He never spoke of his wife and daughter, but the haunted look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet peace. Mara stayed. She helped rebuild. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the feel of the land. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were fewer and farther between. She had found something she never knew she was looking for. Not just safety, but a place to belong. She sent inquiries about the other girl, Lily, but the trail was cold. Still, she never gave up hope. One evening, as the sun set over the vast open prairie, Mara and Gideon stood on the porch of their new home, watching the sky turn to fire. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was no longer heavy with pain, but comfortable, easy. They were 2 broken souls who had found each other in the darkness and walked out into the light together. Her life wasn't over. It was just beginning. And Gideon, the man who had buried his past, had finally learned that you can't run from who you are. Sometimes, justice isn't about a badge on your chest. It's about choosing to do what's right, even when it costs you everything. It's about refusing to look away. This story shows us that betrayal can cut deeper than any knife. But it doesn't have to be the end of our story. We are all stronger than the pain that others inflict upon us. And even when you think your fighting days are over, courage can find you again, right when you're needed most. Now, I have a question for you. If you were in Mara's shoes, do you think you could have found it in your heart to forgive Eliza? And for Gideon, was he right to turn down the badge and stay on the ranch? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps more than you know. And if you want to join me for more tales of justice, redemption, and the wild frontier, make sure you subscribe. Thanks for listening.